Hey there, government class. Mr. Lambright here with the slides from Monday, September 28th. So today we talked about the difference between Federalists and Anti-Federalists in the founding of the Constitution. So after the Articles of Confederation proved to be difficult in holding the country together, there was a debate by the founding fathers over the nature of the new government they were forming in the Constitution. On one side, there was the Federalists, led predominantly by Alexander Hamilton, who believed in a strong central government. They wanted each state to have their own government as they had, but they wanted one central government to have power over all of the states. This is where the concept of a Congress and a presidency came from. A big reason for their concerns and their wanting of a central government was for monetary purposes. So they wanted to create a central bank, potentially, or even just a central currency. They thought that would help the economy, and they were worried about all the different currencies, like we talked about back in the slave economy, that had been coming up throughout the states. The Anti-Federalists, led predominantly by Thomas Jefferson, were mostly Southerners who were worried about the idea of having to share a lot of their newfound wealth through the plantation economy with the northern part of the country. They were also very afraid of this idea of tyranny, which was fair because they just fought a war to get out from under the rule of a British king. They saw this new idea of a central government as kind of an overarching, tyrannical, oppressive form of government, and so they wanted to advocate for just the way it had been with each individual state's sovereignty. They claim to represent the common man in many of these sentiments, and the reason I point that out is because that has continued even through to today. When we look at the common sentiments of states' rights advocates, people who use that term, it has been somewhat weaponized by the right and the conservatives, generally Republican Party, starting in the 50s and 60s to appeal to Southern whites who were upset about the end of segregation. So they saw imposition of civil rights laws as a great example of the overreach of the federal government. So this was an easy way to gain political points, particularly in the Nixon and the Reagan campaigns, to gain the racial resentment that had been fostering in the South for a long time and was now at a boiling point over the civil rights movement onto their side by appealing to things like states' rights and saying that their people's right to discriminate and to segregate, and in many ways later with evangelicals to try to prevent things like abortion, was a matter of states' rights. And so people can see the more liberal view of allowing personal freedoms as a form of a big government stepping on the ability of states to regulate themselves. We see that regulated or represented often in movements like this. We often see this on people who are more on the political right. The "don't tread on me" type symbology is a big advocacy for individual freedoms, but particular individual freedoms that are often associated with racial undertones and often with very particular personal freedoms that want maintained. What we got in the final Constitution was a compromise between the two. So on one hand, we had something like the Supremacy Clause, which, if you want to read the entirety, I don't need to because I don't have the time on this video, but it effectively said that the Constitution supersedes I can't move this. Constitution supersedes that of the state. So states are allowed to make laws. Each state can have laws that differ from one another, but they can't contradict the Constitution of the federal government. So if you make a law in Washington state that is counter to what is in the federal Constitution, that can be challenged and it will be struck down because the Constitution of the United States supersedes that of each individual state. We also, however, got the Bill of Rights. So when it was determined that in the future they might add new laws as amendments to the end of the Constitution, the Southern states and the Anti-Federalists said, okay, but what we want to make sure is that all of these new laws will follow the parameters that we set out in these first 10 amendments. So they set out the Bill of Rights that would protect personal freedoms and state sovereignty in the way that they had been established in the Constitution right here in perpetuity, forever, because any new laws would have to follow these particular rights. And that same would go of any new laws, even at the state level.